Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? To begin with, researchers have found a probable association between a handful of genes and being left-handed. Left-handedness has always been known to have a slight genetic cause, the exact degree of which was uncertain. It was generally thought that it would be around 25%. But the exact genes that were associated with their outcome were unknown. A new study involving about 400,000 individuals from the UK found that there were 4 particular genetics that were associated with this. 3 of these were involved in proteins, and these in turn were part of the brain's structure and development system, in particular the cytoskeleton, which creates much of the brain's structure. This, in partnership with about 10,000 scans of the human brain, found that there were variations that closely correlated with the genetic variation in white matter distribution, and particularly the tracks that ran between the language processing regions. They found, in particular, that with left-handed patients, the language areas of the brain would communicate across hemispheres more effectively and in a more coordinated way than those that were right-handed. While the data set is not conclusive and is largely observational, it would stand to reason that with a strong genetic predisposition, those who are likely to become left-handed will become left-handed. Conversely, it also explains the 90-10 split in the human population, where 90% of people are right-handed and 10% of people are left-handed. In an extension of last week's story on the mysterious vaping illness, the total number of people who have died has now reached 6, and no definitive source for the condition has been found, with more states issuing health warnings. In an extension of last week's findings about vitamin E in the oil, New York State officials are issuing subpoenas to companies that manufacture things known as a thickening agent. These contain high levels of vitamin E and are commonly used in black market products that contain THC. In a similar bizarre case study, a woman from Sacramento wound up in the emergency room with numbness in her hands and feet, slurred speech, and trouble walking. However, she was not having a stroke, as you may think. She was suffering from mercury poisoning. This came from a tainted wrinkle cream that had been imported. As you may or may not know, mercury is an extremely dangerous neurotoxin. It is very dangerous in both the short and long term. It is one reason why students are no longer allowed to play with liquid and semi-solid mercury on open benches with bare hands. In fact, you're not supposed to use it in any open environment, and instead specially dedicated fume hoods. Unfortunately for this poor woman, her condition has deteriorated and she's now in a coma. She came to be in this unfortunate state because the cream she was using had been contaminated with methyl mercury. As noted in other videos, it is possible for compounds to move through the skin and into the bloodstream, where they can then travel around the body and cause harm. In this case, the woman received a significantly large dose every time she applied her anti-wrinkle cream. Normally, there would be up to 5 micrograms of methyl mercury per liter of blood. This woman had 2,630 micrograms, a substantial increase if nothing else, and certainly more than enough to cause neurological damage. Unfortunately, direct skin contact is not the only way she could have been exposed. If applied to her face, there is a good chance it may have turned into a vapor, and then, through the simple process of respiration, she would receive a second dose of methyl mercury, an otherwise prospectively benign product causing substantial and long-term harm. without a known prognosis for the woman in question. In more extreme and alarming news than unfortunate self-poisoning, at least a dozen cases of Eastern equine encephalitis, which is otherwise known as triple E, have been identified in parts of America. 2 people have died so far. Triple E is rare, but incredibly dangerous. It is most often diagnosed in livestock, where it causes considerable damage. This should be obvious from its name, Eastern equine encephalitis, equine being the word for horse. However, just because it's found in horses does not mean it cannot transfer to humans. The most common method for this is mosquitoes, and this is part of the reason why those states with large swampy areas and wooded areas have been hardest hit by this. So far, the following states have been affected: Massachusetts, Michigan, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Indiana, Ohio, Maine, New Hampshire, Delaware, Florida, Connecticut. The best way to protect yourself is relatively simple measures: long sleeve shirts, pants, and the use of a bug repellent. Hopefully with time, fewer hosts, and as a result less transmission, the disease will die out for a time and come back again next year. In another instance of mysterious diseases, Norway, and in particular Oslo, has suddenly been hit by a number of dogs dying, and vets are unsure as to why. It begins with signs of vomiting and bloody diarrhea, and the condition skyrockets from there, eventually ending in death. So far, of the 200 dogs that prospectively carry this mysterious illness, 26 have already died. The disease diagnosis went from Oslo, the capital of Norway, right across the country in very short order. The more disconcerting element is that nobody knows what's causing it, despite similarities in symptoms. The fact that it is across the entire country around the same time leads health experts to think maybe there's some common feature, but all the normal culprits have been ruled out. As a result, health officials are now looking at less common items like mushrooms, viruses, bacteria that don't commonly cause this, and parasites. Unfortunately, it's proving very hard to help man's best friend. In more upbeat and enjoyable news, the world is a step closer to a more improved version of the polio vaccine that may be able to finally eradicate the disease. Polio is a truly horrible disease and left the world in a very bad state for a very long time. Thanks to the efforts of Jonas Salk and his choice to make the polio vaccine free, incidence has gone down by 99%. One big concern that has been developing over the last 15 years in particular is among areas that either have poor vaccination rates or, in some cases, don't use vaccines at all, and that is in those populations that do receive the oral vaccine, which has a live but weakened virus, something called attenuation. This attenuated virus will eventually develop, or at least reacquire, its ability to cause significant and long-term damage, effectively becoming a pathogen once more. Theoretically, this is not impossible or all that hard. In practice, we simply don't know how it works in this instance, and in fact, how it is doing it, and importantly, how we could prevent it with a new vaccine that would be able to prevent it from occurring again. There are 3 major strains of the polio virus, simply called PV1, PV2, and PV3. PV2 is the one that is a concern. The World Health Organization pushed for years to have all the medicines used to treat it or to provide prophylaxis only contain the PV1 and PV3 strain. This was eventually accomplished in 2016. Unfortunately, the vaccine-derived pathogenic PV2 virus continues to circulate in the wild, particularly among those who have been vaccinated but for whom the vaccine has not taken properly, often in those populations without proper herd immunity. This is commonly an issue in areas that don't have the logistical or financial systems in place to provide the injected version of the PV2 vaccine. This contains a killed virus, not the attenuated virus. If you are in a region that relies on the oral vaccine, which is the attenuated virus, then you are in theory running the risk of creating areas that do not have a completely vaccinated population. This is where current research comes in. Researchers are attempting to target that area where the virus might become pathogenic once more and intercept that before it can occur. They have been able to map out in detail how the PV2 vaccine strain can regain its pathogenic status. The interesting part is it is only 3 small genetic mutations that allow the strain to regain its virulence. They have done this by creating a number of changes to the genome, in particular targeting a protein structure that is important for its pathogenicity. The second is to target an enzyme, and the third is to change that enzyme so that it cannot recombine with other viruses. In another example of genetic modification, and going back to a previous story to some degree, CRISPR editing has allowed cells to block HIV. These cells have retained their relative immunity to HIV for over a year without any side effects. These Chinese researchers have gone a very different route to that of Dr. He. Rather than try and make the whole organism resistant to HIV, they have instead modified hematopoietic stem and progenitor cells. These were then transplanted into a 27-year-old man. The man carried 2 diagnoses, one being leukemia and the other HIV. Having leukemia, the man was able to receive a cell transplantation, and this allowed them to engage in CRISPR modification before he received the cell transplant. Unfortunately, the transplant only replaced about 5% of his lymphocytes. This is important in HIV, as the lymphocytes act as a reservoir for the HIV virus. Importantly, although only 5% of the cells were replaced, and the patient could not go off their antiretroviral therapy, the 5% that were changed were not infected by the HIV virus. This is a relatively remarkable achievement considering the fact that, under normal circumstances, most cells would have no immunity whatsoever, and, by comparison to Dr. He's research with the CRISPR babies, is a substantially safer, more ethical, and likely to succeed methodology. Finally, there is a little bit of paranoid news. Some apps you are using might have been able to tell Facebook whether or not and when you last had sex. 2 menstruation tracking apps, Maya and Mia Femme, were sharing details of the user's sexual health with Facebook and other entities. Unfortunately, this is only coming out after a UK watchdog released their report, going beyond just Facebook's access to this data, whether in limited ways or not, as claimed by Facebook. These same kind of apps could be sharing your personal data with companies like insurance providers and, prospectively, your employer. Consider the implications of this. along with 1.2 billion daily users and the release of their own dating app. This means Facebook has access to a lot of personal information at many different levels and through many different avenues. And they're asking for more every day, it seems. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.